Good morning and welcome to the webinar today, brought to you by InEight and working in partnership today with the Australian Institute of Project Management. So very excited for today. We've had a few discussions in the lead up to this, and I think we're in for a really interesting hour ahead of us on the topic of why you need to have digital as part of your project management strategy. So I'll ask all of you now to sit back with your coffee in hand, listen to what our panel have to say. But at the same time, we do want to hear from you. So please do make sure that you use the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen to provide us with any questions that you might have. And give us feedback. Really important for us to understand whether we're doing a good job for you and meeting on your expectations of what you want to hear and what you want to listen to as we get through this conversation. So I am here with a couple of seasoned experts from the industry in project management, and I'll introduce Michael and Brad very shortly. Just before we do get into that, just to give you a bit of background, and the focus for today's session is really around a recent blog that one of the AIPM members, GHD, developed and explored, which was around how the digital age is changing and the way that we manage our projects today. And you can view that blog on the AIPM website. But the interesting points highlighted by those authors were really around how in this digital age, already the roles and the behaviours and expectations of project managers are changing, and particularly what we see in the construction industry. The construction industry in itself is going through those life cycle changes as any industry does. And there's a lot of criticism often about the underinvestment in digital technology from the construction sector. So the real question is, how well is the sector keeping pace with change? And one of the first things we want to do is see what you all think to get you engaged in the early part of this session. So the question for you in that is, do you believe that the industry is keeping pace with change? Is the construction industry keeping pace with change in how it manages projects? And I'm seeing the polls come through live here, and there's some interesting opinions being voiced. So we'll see how that settles down as we get through all of those votes in the next couple of minutes. The article then goes on to explore around how AI, big data, and machine learning has a role to play in that. And there's some really interesting themes, and we'll touch on those. But also one of the other things that I know we're going to get into is what lessons there are to learn from other sectors and other industries. So we can see how we as an industry in the construction sector can improve the way that projects are delivered through the application of digital technology. So just as we get those answers settling in, I will ask our panel members to introduce themselves. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Michael Young. And Michael is the CEO of a consulting firm that manages and helps firms around the world to improve their operational efficiencies, and also a former chair and board member of the Australian Institute of Project Management. So, Michael, welcome to you.
Oh, g'day, Rob. Thanks. Really excited to be here today and to continue the discussions we've had before now, and in particular, keen to see what people out there have to think and say as well. So, looking forward to today.
Excellent. Thank you. Also joined by Brad Barth, coming to us from Omaha, Nebraska, part of InEight. And Brad has been involved in both the construction side of business and the technology side for a number of decades, and has been on the journey with InEight through its entire life cycle as a business and solution. So Brad, welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Great to be here. Good to be with you, Michael. Looking forward to the discussion today. Like you said, I've been at this construction technology thing for a long time, going on 30 years, all my career, and grew up in the construction industry. So looking forward to hearing from the audience today and from both of you on some of the trends, and looking forward to the discussion. So thanks for having me.
You are welcome. Good to have you here. So just to get us started, everyone's put their votes through now, and 43% of those of you with us today say that no, the construction industry is not keeping pace with change. 37% of you aren't sure, and so hopefully through the course of the next hour we'll be able to help you form a solid opinion on whether we are or whether we're not, and without wanting to be too prescriptive or presumptive, I'm thinking there's a lot of room for improvement. 20% of you say yes, we are keeping pace with change. So very interested to hear from you as well on where you see things happening. And of course, there are some great things happening with a lot of very innovative and frontline businesses out there. So I guess there's signs of that change being implemented. So going to open that question up as a starter now for Michael and Barth and ask you both, what do you feel about the industry? And perhaps start with Michael, your perspective from outside construction. How do you see the construction industry keeping pace?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Rob. So I guess I've had the good fortune to work in a number of different sectors in a number of different countries, and particularly coming from that project management side of things, I sort of see what works and what doesn't work across a range of countries. And what's really interesting is that when you look at the construction sector, and in particular at the question, we've seen a huge amount of change occur, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. You mentioned in the introduction things like big data and AI, and what we've seen is a range of technology tools being used across different sectors. Talking specifically about construction, what we're seeing is the increased use of drones, for example, and some of the technology that's on board on drones. There's a whole pile of calculations can be done on the fly, and you can get a real good sense of actually what's going on without having to put people onto the site. And so you can use sensors like that to be able to really measure what's going on. So we're seeing a range of other shifts as well, and I'll talk a bit more about how that impacts on skills and how that impacts on projects more broadly.
Yes, some interesting perspectives to take there. And Brad, in opening, what are your thoughts from inside the industry? What are you seeing, and how well do you think we're keeping pace?
Yeah, I would love to see the survey response if it was a year ago compared to today. Because I think we've seen an acceleration in the industry's adoption of digital technology, especially over the last year or so, as people have been forced to work in a virtual mode and collaborate in ways that maybe they weren't used to. So I think that's I think what you're seeing is the transformation from this sort of all digital approach, going from it used to be more of a differentiator, more of a kind of fall into the nice to have category, where it's, I think over the last year, it's starting to kind of cross that hump of it's almost sort of expected now, right? If you're not adopting these technologies, you're behind the curve now, right? It's, as an industry, I think we're getting over that hump, and I think part of that is all the things Michael talked about. For sure, there's a lot of new technologies out there that can do things that were perhaps difficult for humans to do. For example, the drones, right? Doing inspections, they can do those things, get into tight spaces or challenging or dangerous spaces, perhaps much more efficiently than a human could.
Sure.
But also just the sort of consumer-driven technologies, mobole phones, right, is a perfect example, right? That's the expectation now. Younger folks coming into the industry aren't going to put up with doing things like paper timesheets and sharing information over radios and over phone calls, right? Where that's just not what they're used to now. The mobile generation has kind of changed the industry quite a bit, I think, as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned the consumer side of things, and I think there's a lot of technology that is just ubiquitous, that's part of all of our daily lives now. And perhaps with those respondents that have said yes, 20% feel that we are, I wonder how much of that is actually just in the day-to-day fabric of life, that technology is a default that's applied to every aspect of our lives. And that includes, of course, the construction sector and work on site and work in the office. But to push the boundaries a little bit further, if we think about where's the opportunity and where's the gap, what do each of you feel are the gaps that are there now that should be filled, and where technology should be applied to see efficiency and to see productivity improve? And again, to get your perspective, Michael, on the broader economic environment and broader industries. Let's start with you.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So if you look at technology change across a multitude of sectors, you mentioned the mobile phone, and there's things that we do on a mobile phone or a mobile device now that only 2 or 3 years ago was inconceivable. And so, you're seeing, people carrying their phones onto a construction site. It automatically checks them into the site. If there's any information, safety information that needs to be conveyed, it can be automatically pinged to people's phones and so on. So we're seeing, as Brad mentioned before, that crossover into construction. Where I think there's huge opportunities is with machine learning, AI, and big data. And if you think about some of the key things from a project management perspective, often the things that project managers hate doing, that take a lot of time, are things like reporting. And where naturally machines, computerization, and so on excels is around things like prediction and calculation. And so if you think about developing project schedules or programs, and also undertaking risk assessments, if we've got big data sources that we can basically leverage, and machine learning and AI tools we can leverage, what it practically means in time is that we don't need to actually undertake risk assessments anymore. We can actually feed certain parameters into a system, and the risks will be identified and they'll automatically be ranked and rated. Likewise, from a scheduling perspective and programming perspective, we can feed in basic parameters, and the AI tools will automatically create the schedules that's optimized based upon a range of factors. And so likewise with reporting, no longer will we need to go to site to actually do site inspections and so on. We can use a network of data sources. That could be, drone imagery. It could be a whole range of sensors and so on. And we can capture that data and collate it and create a real-time picture or a real-time dashboard as to where things are currently at or where they should be. And so when it comes to, the things that we all love to hate as project managers, reporting, well, we won't need to do that in time. That'll happen automatically. Risk management and scheduling, that'll be done automatically by computer systems that are far, far better at estimating and predicting than we are as humans.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, that we're actually talking about an elevation of the role of project managers and the tasks that they're performing, and freeing up some of that time. So, Brad, in your time working in the industry and supporting the industry, what are you seeing on that front? Are you seeing that change in the roles within project teams and how they're calling for technology to fill that gap?
Yeah, for sure. I think probably the biggest evolution is in the recognition that information by itself is not necessarily useful beyond the current project or the current problem in front of us. We've got typically in this industry a lot of reliance on Excel spreadsheets, which doesn't do a lot of enforcement around, data fit, from project to project or system to system or role to role. So I think one of the things that we hear quite often from customers and prospective customers is, hey, we hear about the opportunities through machine learning and even artificial intelligence to help us work smarter, but we know that we've got to feed that system with information, right, and turn that information into knowledge. So, there's, I think, a recognition that, all these Excel spreadsheets lying around are not really going to help us, machine learning or otherwise, right? We can't make a lot of sense out of that data. So, I think that's probably the biggest trend that I think we're seeing in terms of just being able to capture information in a way that it can be reused more effectively and it can be shared more effectively. Because I think this industry's traditionally sort of blamed when projects don't go well. The blame typically falls to the execution side of things, right? It's we didn't work fast enough. We didn't, get the work done fast enough, and that's kind of where the blame has been. But I think there's a gradual recognition that it's more in the planning. We're not planning properly. We're not creating the right expectations up front. Mm-hmm. And that's what project management is ultimately all about, right? Setting expectations and managing the outcomes, and you hope they match. And but to do that requires to do a better job of planning. like Michael was saying, right, a lot of the new technologies can help us. We capture the data the right way from all of our previous projects. Humans and technology can both kind of leverage that information, get smarter, and be more predictive, so that some of that more grunt work or tedious work can be set aside and focus on more strategic things.
Right.
And I guess that one of the things we see is that there's things that we innately do really well as a human being, but there's also a whole pile of things that as a human being we're not particularly great at. And you only need to look at some of the psychology literature to identify that we have a whole pile of biases. We have an optimism bias. And so when it comes to predicting or estimating how long things are going to take, we naturally assume that it's going to go swimmingly well, there's not going to be any issues. We tend to underestimate the duration and effort things take or it will take to deliver a particular project and so on. And so innately we're not great. The human brain's not great at doing a lot of that predictive work, but we've got machine tools, AI, machine learning, and so on. That's what they do really, really well, and they learn, and they can do it far better than even the best human can do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That there's probably nothing more resilient than a project planner in the construction sector in terms of optimism as an attribute, right? So, I guess if that's making it a little bit easier today, Michael, keen to understand from your broader experience how you're seeing project management in construction evolve against other sectors. I mean, is there a bar across sectors where you're seeing the tasks and things being performed by project managers falling under what you see in other sectors?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And when you go look at what's happening in the project management space around the world, obviously different countries and different economies are at different stages of growth and development. And I've had the sort of good fortune to work with experts around the world developing international project management standards. And so you get into the real nitty-gritty as to, what we do, how we do it, and so on. The great thing about it is that you're looking at the way projects are planned, scheduled, managed, etc., across different industries, but also across different countries and different cultures. And so you get a real sort of, snapshot of what's going on when you're sort of involved with these things. What's interesting is that there's elements around different sectors that are great. But I think that where a lot of the innovation really comes from is when we start to look across sectors and look at what different industries are doing. And so whilst it's probably a generalization, a lot of the construction type scheduling approach, for example, is largely sort of predicated on that sort of waterfall or more of that engineering style of model where we do all our requirement specifications, we do all our design work, and then we do all our build, not necessarily in a linear kind of fashion, but it tends to be more along those lines. Part of the challenge, of course, is that particularly given the contracting models that are used, where we're wanting or we're being asked by clients to sign up to some sort of fixed price or firm price type model, that sort of locks us into a particular way of delivery as well. And so We've got a few factors that come into play. When we look in different sectors, and whilst it's not all directly applicable to construction, we're seeing a lot more iterative and agile kind of models being used. And whilst that's not necessarily going to work in a lot of that hard construction kind of scenarios, there are plenty of examples where a more agile or iterative model could actually be applied in a construction sense.
Okay, and that is interesting. The thought that the industry could be shaken up a bit by some different approaches. If we think about the evolution of the construction industry and the challenges it's facing, I think one of those very distinct challenges right now is the scale of projects. We're seeing bigger projects than ever coming through, and we're talking here about not just the volume of work, but the scale of it. So we've got projects that are potentially 10 years, or certainly between 5 and 10 years in duration, and multi-billion-dollar projects. We're talking about 15, 20, $25 billion as programs of work. So what do you think that does to call for that transformation, and what needs does that bring in addition to just us catching up as an industry? And Brad, with your exposure, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think the increase in size of the projects just raises the game in terms of managing the risk, right? Because the larger the dollar value of the projects, the those risks turn into ripple effects that can be quite large, right? So from the owner's perspective, if you're funding the project, not only are you counting on the success of that project, but if that project goes off the rails, you've got a ripple effect of we've got to perhaps pull funding from other projects in order to get this one back on track, or we might need to de-scope the project in order to stay on budget if it's a budget issue, or get it done sooner if it's a schedule issue. And that turns into, it cuts into the return on investment we're getting as the owner of that asset that's being constructed, right? So I think the bigger projects create more opportunity to let risk get away from you and have that, sort of downstream effect if you're not careful, because, in this industry, as we talked about kind of getting going, there's a history of coming in over budget and coming in behind schedule. In fact, there's been studies that have been done that have kind of shown there's a $1.6 trillion opportunity in the construction industry globally to fix that problem. And so that means, it gets back to that better planning, right? So part of the challenge we have in the industry is learning from past projects. So,
right.
To your point, these projects are quite large. They take a long time to do. So any individual person, you're not doing 10 or 20 or 50 projects a year, right? You might you'll do a big project once every 5 years. And so it's really critical to capture the experience on that project and those lessons learned so that other people in the organization can benefit from that knowledge.
Yep.
So that the risks and scenarios and assumptions that we hopefully validated on that project can be leveraged by everybody else who didn't go through that project. They were on other projects, right? So that whole collective, kind of collective knowledge and collective experience, I think, is critical the bigger the projects get, right? Because the risk gets larger.
Absolutely.
And I think it's certainly an area that collectively we're not great at that lessons learned piece. I tend to talk about it as lessons learned rather than lessons learned, as lessons identified and right. Often lessons forgotten and then relearned. I saw a really quite funny thing on I was scrolling through Facebook the other day, and it was sort of almost like the Dilbert cartoon, the three sort of panes. And the first one was Department of Lessons Learned. The next door was Department of Lessons Learned, Forgotten, and then Relearned. And the last one was the Department of, come on, guys, can't we get this right? And I thought it was so true.
Yeah.
I think the challenge we're seeing comes back to that sort of volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world we're living in. And so the rate of change we're seeing has accelerated exponentially. And what it means from a construction perspective and a project perspective more generally is that, as you said, Rob, the projects are getting larger, they're getting longer in duration, and there's been this sort of expectation creep also by clients. And as the projects get larger, just simple technology change, we see rapid amount of technology change, and what you start with at the design or requirements phase could be well outdated, when it comes to build time. There's some classic case studies. One of the great examples in Australia here was our existing submarine fleet, and they specify technology in the actual submarine itself. These were built about 15, 20 years ago. And the particular technology they specified was superseded by 4 generations by the time they actually came to do the build. And they found themselves having to constantly go back and update and change all of their requirements and specs because the technology kept changing all the time. And so you ended up with this sort of chasing your tail kind of scenario. Where it becomes really interesting is that, we're seeing all sorts of technology being built into buildings. Everyone's been talking about BIM now for ages, but we're also seeing a lot of smart buildings. And so we're using a range of sensors to do everything from vent buildings to, activate and tune air conditioning and a range of different things. And so as we start to see a lot of this automation technology come online and being used more widely, that just adds to the complexity no end. And so this is where we probably need to look at different contracting models, but also look at different more sort of iterative models. Just on that, what's been really interesting and where the expectation changes comes back to the good old phones. We see the way that software companies churn out an app for the phone now. It's put out in the market very, very quickly, and the focus is really around getting it to market. In the construction sector, we don't quite see that necessarily. There's definitely there's a push and a drive to get things done quickly, but we still tend to be doing things the way we've done it for a long time. We need innovation.
That's a really good point, actually, as you mentioned it, because for all the value that comes from lessons learned in previous projects, actually looking at a different way of doing something is critical. And there's another interesting challenge the industry faces right now, which is a labour shortage and a skilled labour shortage, because we have that many projects, particularly in this part of the world, going on right now. So what are some of the solutions and things that we can think about there to take lessons from other industries and to think about how people coming across and transferring skills from other sectors might be able to influence the construction sector and project management? And so, Michael, what's been your experience across that sort of challenge and that sort of issue?
Yeah, and it's I think we need to think outside the box. I know it's a cliche and is often spoken about, but what you tend to find is that reality is that we've all worked in a particular sector, and we tend to move from one client or one organisation or one employer to the next. And so whilst every organisation's got sort of their way of doing things, we tend to see only very small incremental change. And, we try and do it just a little bit better, or we refine it a little bit. And we don't get that sort of truly innovative step when we go looking at our competitors. So a great story I read about a little while ago was Southwest Airlines in the US. And typical airline, they fly people around, usual sort of scenario. Well, the problem was they were effectively, they'd almost become bankrupt. And the only way they could turn around the company was they had to keep the planes flying. They needed more planes, because the way the airline makes money is they've got to have aircraft in the air with bums on seats. Right. And, if they're not flying people, they're not making money. If the planes are sitting on the ground, they're not making money, right? So they looked at purchasing and leasing additional aircraft. Well, that was off the table because their balance sheet wasn't looking real good. So the only option they really found was that they had to turn the aircraft around more quickly. So when it lands, turns up to the airport, they need to basically get everyone off, refit the aircraft, clean it, do all the things that they need to do, get the people onto the aircraft in a really sort of swift manner. That way it spends less time on the ground and obviously more time in the air. Well, what a lot of companies would do in that scenario is they go and look at their airline competitors and they go, oh, well, maybe we can do what these guys do or what those guys do. Well, someone would actually, was really thinking outside the box, and they actually went and did a benchmarking exercise. And the benchmarking exercise is not the sort of thing that you would naturally jump to. And if you think about, what thing, sport, situation requires an absolutely super, super fast turnaround. Well, it's actually a Formula One pit crew, right? They can fill up the car, they can change 4 tyres in about 2.1 seconds, right? So that's a really good pit stop. And so what Southwest Airlines did is they went to, I think it was Ferrari, and they actually studied the way that their pit crew operated. They also looked at the way that and hospitals have done the same thing with operating theatres. They've actually studied the way the pit crews work. Wow. And what they've identified is everyone has a very specific role in someone. Now, in this instance, they changed the turnaround time from something like an hour and a half down to about 26 minutes. So massive, massive improvement. And they couldn't get it less than 26 minutes because it physically takes an amount of time to get people on and off an aircraft. Right. But they looked at, the sequencing of all the different parts, who does what and how it'll work. And so they were able to turn around the organisation from benchmarking with the Formula One crew. And so,
Brilliant.
often you really got to think outside your industry and your sector and think about, well, where is the best of breed in that particular function?
I love it. I love it. Just imagine, I think I can see quite a few construction crews and machinery being managed with jumpsuits and crash helmets and stopwatches. I think that could be a thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. Awesome. Well, we've got a couple of questions come through. So thank you very much to those of you posting those. So I want to tackle those for the audience. One of those, I think, comes back to what we were talking about before around scale. But the question is, as more software and digitization is implemented, we're seeing more delay or projects that are being flagged with delays. So is there a correlation there, or is that just a coincidence? What are your thoughts around that? Are we slowing things up by trying to get too smart with technology?
I'll jump in on that. I think you're going to have the first project. You might suffer some delays, right, as you're implementing new technologies, getting used to it, rolling it out, right. Like anything else, you kind of got to get that institutionalized and get through that process. You might have some bumps in the road, right? But typically, what we see, as customers are rolling out, whether it's software technology that's going to help you work more productively and plan better. Or even technologies like we were talking about out to help you execute better. Once you get it down to the point where it becomes a road, right? That's the next time and the next time and every time after that, you're going to see those improvements, right? So that's part of the challenge I think that the industry has had, is taking that time, and knowing that first project or maybe even the first two are going to be a little more challenging as you get that new technology under your belt. So.
Right.
It starts with the owners, right? The owners of these projects that are spending the money have got to often have been the ones that have driven the change, because the contractors are going to do what the owners contract with them to do. Yeah. So, it comes down to, commitment to making that change and doing it the right way and getting over that hump in order to get all the benefits from that on.
Okay. Yeah, and certainly, just picking up on another couple of the comments and questions along the same kinds of themes here. What we're often seeing is the way that a project manager currently manages a schedule is that often it's highly subjective, and so one thing we'll see as a change is that often the project manager will go, well, I reported 60% last week or last month. I've got to show some progress, so we're going to report 65% this month, right? Now, the reality may be that there's actually been no progress at all, but we can't show the same figures as last month because it shows we're not doing any work. And so when you're actually getting data feeds from calculated tools or from live data, AI or machine learning tools or whatever it is, what you'll actually see is the real scenario, not what the subjective view is. And so, yes, you may see some so-called delays, but the reality is they were always there as just possibly the project manager or the whatever was reporting optimistically or reporting to show that yes, they've made some progress and so on. It's one of my sort of bugbears I see a lot when I'm doing project reviews, and particularly being asked to come in and turn around projects that have fallen over. Often what you find is that when you track back through all of the reporting, you find, yes, there's been progress made, but there's no connection whatsoever between what you see on the ground, what's actually being reported. It's almost like they're two disconnected things. And so I think what will happen is, it's a bit like when you're driving around and you've got the GPS sat nav set in the car. Right. If you try and second guess it and go, oh yeah, I know where to go, and of course, you drive where you think you need to go, you often will find yourself getting lost. If you trust the technology, it's going to give you the real data, this is where we currently are right now. And it'll give you the truth whether you like it or not. Right. Sometimes the answers you get aren't going to be overly nice or palatable, but it is what it is.
It's telling you that the way you've been going for the last 5 years is actually 10 minutes slower than the way that I'm going to navigate you now. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I guess related to that. Sorry, Brad. I was going to say. related to that, and I think I'll let you respond to that one too. But I think a related question on this is around how how reliable is AI, and what faith should we place in the integrity and quality of that data? So Brad.
Yeah, and that, just tying that back to kind of the earlier discussion, I think we work with a lot of owners, right, that are it's their budgets we're talking about here for these projects, and for them it's less about the number itself, whether we're talking about the duration or the cost, and more about the transparency and avoiding those surprises we were talking about that have those ripple effects way beyond just this particular project. So it all gets back to that, like we were talking about, right? Get more realistic plans in place, right? So then it gets back to, well, what is really a delay, right? Is a delay against a unrealistic expectation in the first place? It's all about setting those expectations, right? So if you've got those contingencies and risks and previous lessons sort of baked into the plans, and because one of the things in this industry, particularly when you're dealing with physical assets that you're trying to construct, it's to Michael's point, there is that tendency to kind of report with optimism, let's say, right? We're making great progress. We get to the last 10%, let's say, and then realize that we've got 50% of the schedule left in front of us still, even though we thought we were 90% done. So that last mile effect, I think, is something that the industry is getting better at, and some of these technologies help a great deal, providing that transparency, helping to surface risks, perhaps that the humans are either not looking for, or maybe kind of I don't really want to see those. Don't tell me about that right now. We're making good progress. Let's just keep going.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's interesting if you look at, once again, different sectors. There's been a number of cases only in the last sort of couple of years where they've done test cases in the legal sort of industry, and what they've done is they've used real lawyers, human beings, to go and look at a range of different cases and effectively put forward and prosecute cases based upon historical data and precedent and so on. And effectively the lawyers had to come up with a particular premise or proposition or the way they were going to propose to argue the case. Well, they then pitted that team of lawyers against basically machine tools, computers, AI and so on. And they found that humans were about 40% accurate, and the current technology, which is a couple of years ago now, was approaching 80% accurate. And so, twice as accurate as the average human. And that's not introducing any other kind of bias or optimism or any of those sorts of things. It's just that there's things that technology is fantastic at, and particularly if you're collecting data directly from sensors, and so it's not like someone's plugging in data, therefore you've got data quality problems. There's actually some sort of sensing that's going on. It could be repeated photographs of a particular location on the site, and so you can physically see the change and measure the change. And so when you're getting data like that, there's no data quality problem. Often it comes back to that, we're just talking about the reporting quality problem.
Yeah, reporting's a really interesting one because, as you said, that's traditionally taken up so much of a project manager's time in collating, gathering, and holding everyone accountable for providing that information to then forward as an update. So, if coming back to your point, I want to come back to that point we raised earlier of the changing role of project managers and what technology does to change that role, to enable a broader range of skills to be brought into play. What are you seeing there, Michael? What do you see as either things that have happened in other sectors or opportunities that you're seeing emerge in the construction sector on that front?
So I guess what I'm seeing sort of around the world and very strongly happening in Australia in particular is there's been this sort of resurgent focus on project leadership. And so if you think about the full range of skills the project manager needs to have, if we in the future move towards automated scheduling, automated risk identification management, and automated reporting, a lot of the sort of the technical or harder skills that the project managers have traditionally learnt, that's all taken care of now by these systems. And so what we're seeing is a real shift in a focus on leading the project team, so leadership focus, stakeholder engagement, communication, and in particular, a lot more focus around change management. And so typically around the world, what we're seeing is a shift towards a greater focus on the benefits that the project delivers, and an increased focus on ensuring sustainable outcomes.
Right.
And so, you know, in a technology sense, building a system is not good enough. You need to actually have people using the system efficiently. And so it's a shift from your sort of on time, on scope, on budget to spec kind of scenario, more towards does it deliver the outcome we want? And we've seen, particularly in government over the years, shifting their focus to even in construction. You know, it's not just about building the building, it's about is it being used and is it actually improving, you know, in the case of, say, a hospital, is it actually improving healthcare outcomes? And so their focus is shifting very much towards the outcome. And of course, the project manager needs to adapt, because just building the building and doing that traditional hardcore time scope quality kind of project management doesn't cut it anymore. It's the focus on the outcomes, change management, and in particular, engagement and leadership.
It's less transactional and far more ingrained in the full life of the project, the life cycle of the asset in that respect. So by adopting technology, project management's actually becoming part of the solution, and then employing that and opening up the adoption as well, and then ultimately the improvement and the outcome. That's right. Yeah, that's fantastic. And Brad, I know that there's some areas here that you'd be keen to provide some commentary on, particularly around that life cycle. This concept that project management is no longer limited to a transactional stage of construction, but that we're actually talking about the full life cycle of the asset and how technology assists from the very beginning through to the effectively to the decommissioning of that asset. Yeah, that's right. And you know, you see trends like digital twins, right? Where we want to, as an owner, we want to create, not only a more efficient process as we're going through the design and construction of that asset, or even back to your point, to the conception of that asset, and start to track all of the both the planning side and the outcome side of that whole equation. Track both of those metrics kind of inside the model itself. So if you take a 3D model, what makes it a digital twin is not just sort of the 3D representation of it. It's capturing all of the assumptions that went into the construction of that thing, capturing all of the as-built results, outcomes, if you will, that resulted from that construction process. And that's going to help you manage that asset more effectively for the rest of its life, right? Because if you look at the cost of the asset, the engineering and construction stage is a little bit like this, right? And the other 30, 40, 50 years is continued cost relative to operating and maintaining that asset. So, starting on a good foundation and coming out of the end of construction with good information that can be not only leveraged for the life of that asset, but then leveraged on other assets that are similar or have similar characteristics. That's where that whole digital twin, and it doesn't have to be a digital twin, right? I mean, just a digital approach and capturing that information in a reusable way, in a systematized way, just becomes so valuable, right?
And I guess the other thing too is that obviously we're different people involved with value engineering and various practices around that. I guess what I'm talking about is it's way beyond that. It's not just to do with the actual building itself or what it's designed to. This is all around the organizational change to make sure people adopt the practices and the organization achieves the strategic and commercial outcomes that they're chasing. So we're talking more strategic and more, I guess, change focused rather than necessarily focused on the inputs.
Yeah, and that's been a challenge in this industry, right? Is because the first sight of schedule overrun or cost overrun, the tendency is to de-scope the project, right? Which then cuts into those economic benefits or whatever the perceived benefits were of that asset. You start to cut those down in order to stay on budget or stay on schedule. And ultimately that's from the owner's perspective, achieving the scope that you when you got approval to fund that project, there was an economic business case that you had to make, right, to get the funding for that, and oftentimes that gets whittled away, as you go through the construction process. So, our job in the industry is to not let that happen, right?
Right, to keep that front and center through the full duration. Well, another question we've had come through, which ties back to a topic we touched on before, is the contracting methodologies and what the relationship that has in terms of project management and, again, technology. How do we implement arguably more effective contracting and smart contracting through technology, and the role that has and the role that project management has through that as well. Thoughts on that? Michael, perhaps starting with you on that topic of contracting.
Yeah, I touched on it earlier. One of the challenges we see with contracting is that a lot of the contracting models are sort of, I guess, predicated on this getting 100% clarity around requirements or scope, and that's what's then articulated through a specification or the contract terms and conditions. And then, so what it effectively means is that we need to have everything 100% clear right up front, because a lot of clients like to work to either fixed price milestones or that kind of fixed price kind of model. And so where that becomes a problem is that we don't often know exactly what's going to happen or exactly how long it's going to take until the day after the project is finished, right? And so we only know because when we look in the rearview mirror, we've seen how long it's taken. But we're being asked to effectively estimate or guess, right at the front. And so we learn a lot as we go through the project. And so we find that a lot of the contracting models are quite flawed in their underlying premise, because the assumption they make is that we need to have everything 100% estimated correctly, completely and fully known right at the start. The reality is that many of the projects we're now doing, even in the construction sector, a lot of them are almost research and development activities. Yes, the way we assemble a building probably hasn't changed largely, but we're seeing new materials, we're seeing new ways of assembling those materials or new technology that's being introduced. And so, there's a lot of research and development that goes on. And those sort of contracting models don't take into account for that. So we probably need to see either more iterative type arrangements, more agile type of contracting models. We see a little bit in the design construct kind of models, but we need to work in a more collaborative model between owner and constructor, so that we actually work collaboratively to develop an outcome that works best, rather than effectively trying to get a bunch of terms and conditions and stitch up the builder or the construction company right at the start. That model is really not quite working when we're living in a world that rapidly changes all the time.
Yes. And I think we've started to see that. I know at InEight, Brad, we've seen some of that come through in terms of requirements from contractors as much as we have from owners. And what are you seeing there in terms of how that's changing the role of the project manager potentially?
Yeah, for sure. The owners, I think, invariably want to work more collaboratively with their engineering and contractor partners, right? So it's to Michael's earlier point, you're seeing less and less, especially with the big projects, right? Less and less of the, hey, let's go through a year of design and engineering, and then go into construction for 3 years. Things are just moving too fast now. Technology has changed. So that kind of waterfall approach, kind of fell by the wayside a long time ago in our world in technology, right? As we're creating software, but you're starting to see that kind of start to get whittled away in construction as well. More iterative, and even, more shared risk models, right, where the owner and the contractor are kind of sharing the risk in different ways, which is kind of putting some pressure on the legal support system for the industry that has to change the way they think about contracts in general.
Yes.
But I think back to the how's that changing the role of the project manager? I think there's always going to be, kind of tying this back to the AI. See some of the comments there. The AI is going to help, certainly, as we capture and validate kind of the assumptions that went into Project X and Project Y and Project Z, leveraging that on future projects. So make more of that information available in the conception stage.
Right.
So when the projects are being conceived and those initial budgets being developed, initial schedules being developed, they can be, set proper expectations for those things in the first place. But it's always going to take, that can't completely go to a machine approach, right? Humans are always going to have to interpret that information. I've never been particularly thrilled with the term artificial intelligence, right? Because it's kind of, it's artificial, it came out of nowhere, right? So, but machine learning, particularly at InEight, we're very much interested in how we can leverage machine learning to take all that information, right, that a project manager in today's world has to sort through and make some sense out of. How can the technology do that for him or her, and surface things that you just don't have time to do, surface things that find patterns in the information that if you spend all day long doing that, you might find those patterns, right? But nobody has time to do that. So
yes.
Well, a great example is more from an estimator's perspective than a project manager's perspective, but you're seeing, it used to be estimators, a big part of their job would be to do quantity takeoff, quantity surveying, right? So they roll out the plans and start doing their, dimensional takeoffs. Well, all that information now is in the 3D model, right? Or most of it, I should say, right? So the skill set of an estimator is evolving more towards, hey, you need to know how to interrogate 3D models. You need to know how to manage data, because you can jump into that 3D model and you can get overwhelmed with millions and millions of data fields and information you have to sort out. So that's an example of kind of that transformation that's happening, right? Whether it's estimators, project managers, field engineers, whoever. Yep.
No, that does make sense. Now, we could probably keep expanding on some of these topics and keep rolling for the rest of the afternoon. But just as we start to think about wrapping things up, what are some of the roles that people listening might be able to play in this digital transformation? We saw that there's 20% of our audience at the beginning who felt that the industry was keeping up. The rest either weren't sure or didn't think they were. But across all of those perspectives, what can people do? What can project managers do to become transformational pioneers around digital adoption? So, Michael.
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of things come to mind. Often what you find is whilst every organisation's got their way of working, their way of doing things, and so on, often you find, certainly all the projects I've managed, large projects, often you find that, as the project manager or program manager, you've got pretty much a huge amount of say as to what you do on that next project. And so it comes down to the way you coordinate it, plan it, and so on. And so, certainly what you could do is start using or applying some of those tools in some of those projects. But for firms more broadly, I think it's a case of, do some proofs of concept, do some prototyping or testing, and so on. Now, it's obviously going to take a few different parts of the business or the organisation. Obviously, you're going to need the IT folk to assist, but you also need to think about data sources and get the various people on the project and engineering sides involved as well. And so, the easy step is to do a prototype or a proof of concept or some sort of test. One thing, different organisations I work with, I advocate that what they should be doing is spending a percentage of their project budget on that sort of sandbox kind of setup. So, you're doing prototyping, testing, proofs of concept of a range of different things, and you're running those projects all the time in that organization. Because otherwise you just keep doing what you've always done and you don't have a vehicle or a mechanism to actually innovate and change. Different firms have what they call skunk works. When you look at the way that the Googles of the world operate, what they do is they have these little groups, little think tank skunk works, sandboxes, where people basically test and prototype and do all of those sorts of things. And then if it looks like it's going to be viable and workable for that organization, it's then implemented as part of the way the organization works moving forward. And so it can be applied at those two levels. One's the project level, but also at that organizational sort of strategy perspective is important as well.
Good. Brad, your closing thoughts on that?
I think, my advice would be, sometimes when we talk about terms like digital innovation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, these things sound kind of daunting, right? Like, they're major changes. And I think, set all of that aside, the essence of it and the opportunity for improvement, I think in our industry is mainly around getting better at modeling expectations, right? We talked about it at the beginning, setting the right expectations in the budgets and the schedules. And too often, I think we do a great job kind of breaking the work down into manageable chunks and coming up with costs and schedules and execution plans for each bit of scope. And then we manage the outcome, but what we forget to do is validate the assumptions that went into that, right? So we thought it was going to take this long and cost so much. It cost something different and took longer. But we don't, so we know that, right? We kind of have to know that to do our job, but we don't capture the whys, right? We don't capture the assumptions that went into, why was it different, right? So that we can improve that model. It's kind of like weather forecasting, right? I liken it to weather forecasting. If you're forecasting, which is really what estimating or budgeting or scheduling is, right? It's a forecast. But you can't just sort of predict what the weather's going to be like on Friday and then just record what it was. You've got to have models that continually get better by validating the assumptions, right? What went wrong in that model? Let's make sure we don't let history repeat itself the next time. Right. So digital helps you do that, right? Digital helps you do that faster. It helps you work more flexibly. It helps you share the information easier. So digital is just sort of a means to an end, right? But it's still fundamentally, it's all about, creating those expectations and tracking, validating the assumptions.
Fantastic. Well, we're just about up on the hour. It sounds like the future is bright for project managers in terms of the opportunity to adopt technology and perhaps increase the value of project management even further by drawing from the past, presenting the data to help inform decisions and elevate the role as well. Michael, I think that's one of the most exciting aspects of it from a PM point of view for all those practitioners, is to see how their role could actually be elevated significantly by the adoption of digital technology. So wonderful to have you both with us today. I think there's more in this that we could explore at another date. So we might look at setting up a time and broadening the panel and continuing the debate and discussion. Some fantastic questions from our delegates today. So thank you all for those. It's been a great hour of exploration and discussion. I hope you've all got something out of it and something to take away, and look forward to seeing you all again next time. So Brad and Michael, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Brad. And if you want to continue the conversation, hit me up on LinkedIn, and I've written a couple of articles on a similar kind of topic. So check me out on LinkedIn and I'll happy to chat.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.